Okay, so hello everybody and welcome back. Hope you had a good break and that you found time during your break to read Pericles. For how many of you was this your first time experiencing Pericles? Anybody ever see it staged? Did you see the recent English production?
I saw the one at the AI.
Gosh, I missed that. When was that? Was it? Uh-huh. Okay.
5 or 6 years ago.
And was it good?
It was good.
It was good. This is an amazing, or I shouldn't say amazing, this is a consummately successful theatrical vehicle. It was very successful in Shakespeare's time, one of his most popular plays, and it has been enormously successful in 20th century productions. There was a production at the Globe Theatre in London a couple of years ago, which I did not see, but as I went around, as I do, talking to various groups about Shakespeare, person after person came up to me and said, "Did you see this production? It was so brilliant, I loved it." And for many of the people who saw it at the Globe, they had not read it, they weren't familiar with it as a vehicle. And one of the many things I want to say to you about this kind of play, and about this play in particular, is that the way romance and spectacle intersect with this kind of drama makes for a terrific dramatic experience. That the combination of the adventures, the peripatetic nature of things, the storms, the comic bits, and so forth, and then those amazing moments of confrontation, loss, reunion, mourning, recapitulation, really function very, very effectively on stage. Sometimes I really feel that we're impoverished here by being able only to talk about the plays as texts, but there are things about it and things about all of these late plays that are superb performances, superbly capable of engaging the eye and the ear as well as the mind. For those of you who have now read the play for the first time, I realize that in picking it up, you may not have read the prefatory material beforehand and may not have come to the play realizing that it's probably written by Shakespeare and at least one other person. But certainly there is a change in the style as the play continues, and it becomes, in the middle of the text that we have of Pericles, more recognizable as Shakespearean, whatever that means, more recapitulative of other moments in other plays that we've looked at. Just very briefly, what plays of Shakespeare did some of parts of Pericles remind you of? Yes?
Merchant of Venice.
Merchant of Venice, interesting.
Well, with the caskets, you know, what's on the outside is not what's on the inside.
Oh, very nice, good.
And also the ring which is the moment of recognition for Pericles at the end of the play. There's a ring thing at the end of the Merchant as well.
So tokens and caskets and boxes, and the question of women as containers or contained, women as treasures, women as lost and found, given away, buried, reclaimed, and so forth. So that there is this kind of language of symbol or emblem or allegory in these plays, which we talked about, you're quite right, in The Merchant of Venice, and we talked about the way in which those moments did and didn't seem tonally to synchronize, the fairy tale moments as we often call them, did and didn't seem to tonally synchronize with the pathos of the Shylock narrative, with romantic love plot and so forth, that they seem to belong to a certain kind of storytelling mode. And they seemed also to use a certain kind of symbol or emblem that is familiar from, for example, Freud's reading of dreams, but other readings of symbolic language, where something stands for something and that standing for becomes the beginning of a conversation. And again, you're right to talk about the container and the contained, or the inside and the outside. Good, Merchant of Venice. What else? What other plays of Shakespeare did this play seem to recapitulate for you, to remind you of? Yes, please.
King Lear.
King Lear.
The Winter's Tale.
King Lear and the Winter's Tale. Okay. Well, Winter's Tale we haven't got to yet, so let's talk about King Lear. What parts of King Lear?
The relationship with the father and the daughter, and actually King Simonides reminded me of Lear a little bit when his daughter didn't come to him about being interested in this man, and I don't know if it was supposed to completely just be a front he was putting on, but I got the sense that it was almost like he was trying to control her.
You mean the relationship between Simonides and Thaisa and his pretense, if it is a pretense, to want to ordain her marriage and to resist her supposed choice and so forth. And this we'll see this again in The Tempest too. This question of the rather than the father, as with Brabantio, for example, in Othello, genuinely wishing to ordain or to forbid the marriage choice. It functions more or less as a kind of a test. But yes, it's the various father-daughter relations here seem quotations of or citations of or revisitations of, on the one hand, the father in the comedies, who is the blocking father, as Northrop Frye would call him, the father who says no, the father whose saying no is the beginning of the search for independence and agency on the part of the daughter, who needs to break away from him and from the rules that he seems to set up in order to make a life for herself, in order to justify her choice. We see this with Desdemona when she stands in front of the whole council chamber and says, I choose Othello. As my mother chose you, I chose Othello. As if Brabantio had been part of one of those early Shakespearean comedies that we have been lost, in which you see the romance of the parents of Desdemona. But certainly also King Lear in the extraordinary scene to which we're going to turn before too very long, in the recognition scene between Pericles and his daughter Marina, and also that earlier scene that I think I also talk about in my chapter, in which, caught in the storm, he cries out for patience, and the complete, the constant call for patience, both on his part and also, in the case of this play, on the part of other people who say to him, "Patience, good sir, do not assist the storm," and so forth. The question of what the virtues are and what the limits of patience are when enduring something that seems to be the most extreme kind of privation, whether it's a natural disaster like a storm, or whether it's the death of a wife, the death of a child, the loss of the father's armor, and so forth. There's a moment when Pericles has lost everything. There are various moments when he's lost everything. So there are moments that seem, I can't say deliberately, that's to go too far, but to seem insistently, let me put it that way, insistently to be reminiscent of or evocative of King Lear. Any other plays that we have looked at together that parts of this play would have or might have reminded you of? Yes?
Troilus and Cressida, and it's just a reference here, which turns out differently in this play, but it's when Mariana is being talked to by the bawd, and Mariana says, "The gods defend me," and the bawd says, "If it please the gods to defend you by men, then men must comfort you, men must feed you, men must stir you up." And there's an allusion here to the fact that women are controlled finally by men, that their fortunes are determined by that. And I read that line and I thought of Cressida and her situation, which is of course different from from Mariana's.
Again, this is very well observed. The idea that in certain kinds of situations, what anthropologists have called the traffic in women, the degree to which women are exchangeable goods who are used as negotiation tools between men, whether it's kings or as we saw in Antony and Cleopatra, generals, emperors, heads of armies, and so forth, figures who could make peace. But in this case, where their price is fallen, that it's her body that is not her hand in marriage, but the rest of her that is the object of exchange here, and that this is what they think she's worth at this point. And what she does, it's really an interesting economics actually in this moment, because she says, no, I'm much more valuable to you as a teacher. I can teach singing, I can teach needlework, I can teach virtue. I can teach a whole, I mean, this is Marina as the premier humanist here. She's teaching the entire humanities canon, and she's also teaching female arts. I won't call them femininity, but those things that, the needlework, needlecraft. She's teaching female independence, we could say. She's teaching precisely what she does not have, the capacities of women to represent themselves through their own work. And she also turns out to be an unbelievable proselytizer, much to the dismay, of course, of the sex industry, that that the lords go to her for the usual reason, and they wind up saying, let's go listen to the Vestal Virgins sing. I'm out of the way of running forever, one of my favorite Shakespearean lines. And that I'm no longer interested in things of the body. I have been converted by, and they said, and her captors here, the bawd and the pander, say, let's get rid of her, she's ruining business. She's not only refusing to her or persuading people that they don't need to sleep with her in order to get pleasure from her, but she's also persuading them that this is not, that the house of ill repute, of ill resort, is not where they want to be at all. And she's basically doing that thing, that turning of the abject back into the high, of taking, remember the get thee to a nunnery in Hamlet, the idea where the nunnery is slang in this time period for a whorehouse as well as for a place of total abstinence and virtue and prayer. In this case, she's taking the whorehouse and she's making it into the place of the Vestal Virgins. She is the preeminent Vestal Virgin. So that, I mean, one could do, and I'm doing here, a kind of snapshot, really interesting set of feminist readings about this particular moment. It's not only Troilus and Cressida, but that other play that we read early on in the semester that seems always to take place almost exclusively in this terrain of the body for sale. What's the other play? Measure for Measure, exactly. Where again, this question of virginity, the loss of virginity, the sex trade, the degree to which it's the body that is the object, or how one can transcend having a body, and so on. That the scenes in Act 4 that were often are sometimes highly praised and sometimes criticized, as somehow not in the same fairy tale mode, as indeed they are not, except in their conversion mechanism, not in the fairy tale style, let us say, of the rest of this play, are scenes that should bring us right back to Measure for Measure and to those stews or brothels in where? Where is Measure for Measure set? Vienna, in Vienna. So here we have, again, it's not as if Shakespeare visited this fact, but I was going to say reality, but that's not the issue. This performative fact about Elizabethan Jacobean culture, the idea of the house of ill repute, the idea of the brothel, the idea of the place in which women's bodies are negotiated. It's not that he only visits them in those the early Jacobean plays of Troilus and Cressida and Measure for Measure, but that we come right back to that place here, and that somehow that spot, that brothel, is made the beginning of a moment of transformation. And the scenes are in prose, once again, as you're suggesting. There's a lot of body interplay, and the way in which that's recuperated into these moments of sublime poetry, and in fact of again, conversion in a different sense, is one of the remarkable successes, I think, of this play. So one of the things that I will want to say about this next series of plays that we're looking at, the plays that have been called the romances, the last plays of Shakespeare, the tragicomedies of Shakespeare, is that they do, consciously or not, and who can say, revisit or echo or partner with moments in the tragedies that we have been looking at, and that they turn them to another mode. They turn them into romance. They, instead of being the end of something, these losses are the beginning of something. What cannot happen in the tragedy, that thing that King Lear wants to happen when he holds the mirror in front of Cordelia's mouth and says, this feather stirs, she lives. He wants her to believe that she's breathing when she's dead. That thing that Othello wants to imagine happening, and the audience does it as well, at the end of Othello, that Desdemona should somehow magically have survived not only her second life, but her third life. These moments of irrecuperable loss. So Macbeth saying about Lady Macbeth, she should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. The thing that happens in tragedy is something that cannot be recuperated except on the moral, ethical level, the level of profiting from loss. What happens, among other things, in the dramas of these plays is that somehow it all comes out right and you get a second chance. And you get a second chance partly, not entirely, but partly because of these citations or quotations from earlier plays, and partly because of the presence in these later plays of a second generation. These plays profoundly violate this supposed notion about unity of time and place. This play, of course, takes place in many, many Mediterranean settings. It's extremely peripatetic in that sense. It goes from where to where to where. What are some of the places where? Antioch. Okay, good. We'll talk about the Antioch moment in a second. Where else? Tarsus. Ephesus. Ephesus. Yes, good. Okay. What's Ephesus famous for in the Bible? Sorry? I'm sorry, I can't hear. Yes, letter to the Ephesians, but what are the Ephesians famous for? At least what did Paul think went on? Well, those who practiced magic arts and so forth, the idea that this was a place of magic. Now, does anybody happen to know what other play of Shakespeare takes place in Ephesus? It's a very, very early play. So you're all excused from knowing this. It's the Comedy of Errors. Comedy of Errors is set by Shakespeare in Ephesus, although his sources do not locate it in Ephesus. And it's in all order to call up this Pauline echo of the idea of a people who know magic and who do magic, and where magic is an everyday way of doing things. So Tyre also we could mention, which is the home birthplace of Pericles. Mytilene. All of these, and we could draw a little map. In fact, one of my dreams that I keep raising with the Harvard travel people is that I would love to conduct a tour. I've roughed it out for them, and then I was unable to do it for personal reasons, but I would love to do it sometime in the future, would be one of these Harvard travel tours of Shakespeare's Mediterranean, in which we actually went to the places where these plays were set. So it has this kind of peripatetic quality. But the other thing is this notion of time. It's not only place, but it's also time. How many years elapse in the middle of this play? 14. And why is that? If you're the playwright, why should you commit such a cardinal violation? Yes? So that Marina can grow up, exactly. So that she can grow up, become an agent, become a beloved, become a lover, that she can marry, that there can be a moment at the end of the play where he says, these are going to go off and rule in who goes where? They're going to go to Tyre, I think. Lysimachus and Marina are going to go to Tyre, and Pericles and his restored, thought dead wife, Thaisa, are going to go back to the kingdom of Thaisa's father. That these, the naturalization of the resurrection happens through the generational change. That anybody who's ever said to you, my children are my immortality, that is what is enacted here. This idea that it's not magic, or it's not only magic that produces rebirth here. It's also the transference of the generations. And so there is this gap in the middle of the play. Marina, who we see as this baby born in the storm, and you can, again, see this storm as like the caskets and so forth, as both a real storm, and then it's raining and they're wet and so forth, and also the storm of human catastrophe, of childbirth, it's a cataclysmic event. It's a metaphor, it's a stage metaphor for a cataclysmic event. And out of that cataclysmic event comes the birth of the child Marina, called Marina, for she was born at sea, and then her name, again, becomes so naturalized that you forget to think about what it means until it resurfaces at the end of the play as a recognition sign. That it becomes just a woman's name until it is a magic word, until it's a word that is used as an identification token between father and daughter, and also a name that recalls her whole history in one thing. But the idea of recuperation here, of restoration, happens in part because of the possibility of another generation, another marriage. So this category, tragic comedy, could be here, really anatomized, because there are tragic parts of the play, and there are parts of the play that are not only comic in the sense that they are pleasurable or joyful, but pleasurable in the way that traditional new comedy is. That is to say that there is courtship and there is marriage, and there is, again, a blocking father and the possibility of a resistance, but also ultimately a finding of the true partner and a love test, too, because Lysimachus goes through a kind of love test in which first he's the same as all these other brothel consumers, except he's worse because he's the governor of Mytilene, and so he ought to know better. And he goes through the process of education and conversion that makes him, whatever you think about the suitability of this, at least in the terms of the drama of the play itself, a suitable husband for Marina, about whom he is cautious in that way that comic heroes are cautious. If she's well born enough and if all the circumstances work okay, then indeed I would think of her as a bride. That is, this is not an unconsidered love match, but it is indeed a love match. So romance here as a category, I should say, is not a term that, so far as we can tell, Shakespeare is using to label this play. In the listing this play is in the first folio, you may remember there are 3 categories, not 4. What are the 3 categories? What are the classifications of Shakespearean plays? Yes?
Comedies, tragedies, and histories.
Exactly so. Comedies, tragedies, and histories. There's some question about whether a play belongs among the comedies or the tragedies or the histories. Cymbeline is listed, as we'll see next week, in one place as a comedy, as a tragedy, in one place as a history, and so forth. That at Pericles and Cressida we saw also is in that kind of marginal space. But this concept of romance, what we might call a kind of adventure fairy tale, which is well known in this period in prose and indeed in poetry, that some of the books of Spenser's Fairy Queen are romances or are shot through with romance elements, that the source text for As You Like It, Rosalind, is a romance. So it's not as if this is a category that is invented after Shakespeare, but it's not used to describe these plays, at least by the editors who were part of his own company, or by him within the plays, at the time that the plays are first written and performed. That term becomes a term of powerful currency really in the 19th century, really in the Victorian period, which loved these plays, and which saw them as romantic love stories. This is a Victorian period. It's also the period of Peter Pan, the period in which these kind of fairy tale adventures that take place in Never Never Land, that involve monsters who are also human and so forth, in which it's a kind of a drama of education on the part of the person experiencing them. That these are categories that are appealing to Victorian taste. So the word romance is a term that has been used to describe plays like Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest for 150 years at least, probably. These days, Mel, I'm going to check with you, who is an expert in this. I believe that one is more likely to call them tragic comedies. Is this right? Yeah. You want to say why? You've got the magic wand right in front of you, so you can speak into the microphone. No, please, say a word or two, because I know you've taught these things. Say something about the category, if you would, of tragic comedy. Can you?
Well, it's just a comedy that it starts out as a tragedy, and one would think that it was meandering in that direction, but at the end you have what some would argue seems a false resolution to a play that starts out headed in the direction of tragedy and the irresolvable that you've been talking about before.
it's a hybrid. It's a hybrid genre, the tragicomedy. It is a very popular genre in Shakespeare's own time. The restoration of this term tragicomedy is in part because this is a term which is functional in the early 17th century, whereas the term romance to describe these plays is not so functional, though it's perfectly accurate. But these plays, many of them co-authored, certainly, so they're hybrid in many ways. They're hybrid in that they bring together comedy, tragedy, and history. They're hybrid in that they may bring together more than one author. They're hybrid in that they cover more than one time period. They involve spectacle as well as drama, music as well as words. There's a sense in which we're moving toward a work of art that is quite comfortable with its own mixed nature. Now, we could go all the way back to the beginning of Shakespeare's plays, and I could point out to you moments that are hybrid just like this. So it's not that this is merely a historical development, but it's something that becomes much more vivid toward the end of his career. And this is partly because this is what audiences want, just as when he writes Roman history plays or English history plays or whatever, he's partly writing for an audience that is meeting him halfway, that is attuned to an interest in this. But it's partly because there's a taste for this kind of work. It's a complicated historical moment in which notions of nationalism and national identity are being fused with myths of national origin and national supremacy. This is an emergent moment for stories about national history, of which, so that Spenser at the beginning of this Elizabethan period is writing about King Arthur in much the same kind of way. But we'll see with this play, and even more so with Cymbeline, that one of the many kinds of allegories that are embedded in it is an allegory about the royal family, an allegory about the need to bring the parts of the dispersed royal family together, about the kings and queens who have children, whose children carry on a dynasty, that there are heirs here, and that what's being restored is a certain sense of national history. Again, we'll see it more vividly in Cymbeline than we see it here, because Cymbeline is a play about Britain, and so it has that double message. But here, for example, even in the moment in which the wonderful comic scene, whoever wrote it, with Pericles and the fishermen, in which they are complaining in much the way that Shakespeare's comic low characters do about the weather and the market and so forth, and along comes Pericles out of the water, and he enlists them in his attempt to move on with his life, in a way that, again, those of you who know the earlier plays of Shakespeare, and let us say Twelfth Night, which is a romance, much the same thing happens to Viola, that Viola at the beginning of Twelfth Night is in a shipwreck and comes out of the shipwreck and thinks that she has no living family at all, and wants to start a new life and enlists the help of the indigenous population of Illyria, and moves on to, in fact, rediscover her brother whom she thought was dead, and a new life and a husband and so on. So here, too, out of the water, always in Shakespeare, again, the double signal of death and birth, because storms are disastrous. Look at what happened to this ship in the Antarctic recently, where you think this sort of thing cannot happen and cannot be seen to happen except in the movies anymore, but a ship sinks and people are rescued as it happened, happily. All of them were rescued. But in Shakespeare's time, going on a ship is always a risky business. Storms happen. You remember that in the middle of Othello, that a storm happens and really disperses the whole fleet of the Turks, bringing to the end their threat against the city of Venice and its army. So storms are always dangerous, but they're also here signs of re-beginning and of rebirth, and that this oceanic feeling, as one writes about it from time to time, is here partnered with a literal ocean, with a literal sea here, the Mediterranean Sea, out of which fertile things will come. And again, we saw that dynamic in a play that could easily be called a romance, among all its other things, and that is Antony and Cleopatra. So here's a play that, as we'll look at it in detail, has the markings of romance, fairy tale, shipwreck, loss, rebirth, recognition. It has the dynastic story of the family reunited, and suddenly you see generations of a family where in earlier plays, maybe plays written under Queen Elizabeth, who is not herself a producer of a dynasty, but rather the inheritor of a dynasty, you don't have so much this sense of many generations. So whatever the reason is, you have the parents and the children, you have the sense of the two moments of generation and regeneration. And you also have in this play a kind of political allegory of nation building, of founding a new place or a new dynasty or a new world. So the stories that could have been encoded under history or comedy or tragedy are here again brought together and partnered with that element of fairy tale or fantasy that we have seen hints of in other plays. Where in Othello, for example, did we encounter the genre of the romance? Anybody remember? Yes, please.
Would it not have been in the account that he made to Desdemona of his past?
Absolutely
Which
right.
was supposed to be very romantic.
Tell me some of the elements of his story. Does anybody remember?
I don't remember them, I'm sorry.
He's sold into slavery, he's in deserts, he's in caves, in Anters wild that are caves. He's sold into slavery and he escapes. Again, it's travels and travails. These words have a similar etymology. The word travail meaning trouble, and the word travel, and in our modern sense, these things are happening together in the romance. So it's an adventure with a hero who goes up against unassailable odds and somehow miraculously wins. We are familiar with this in films and in comic books and in video games. Today we have another sort of new moment in which this kind of fantasy hero overcoming all odds is. And what's wonderful about the kind of video game analogy, if I can just dwell on that for a second, is that it empowers the user. That there's a sense here in which the audience of this play of Shakespeare is not merely watching Pericles prevail. It is itself participating in that conquest, in that overcoming, in that moment of self-transcendence. And it's different from the tragic moment. This is the last thing I want to say in a kind of prefatory way. How is the language of this play different from the language of the tragedies, by and large? Yes, Gabe.
A lot more asides.
More asides. For example?
Well, throughout the scene with sending the message over to Pericles between Simonides and or in the argument between the two of them when they're, I suppose that one even more, the argument between Simonides and Pericles, which is kind of has that element of ruse to it. They're
right.
Constantly turning toward the audience and keeping the situation grounded as far as
good.
what's really happening.
Good. So this is very helpful to have because you get these two moments at the beginning of the play in which you've got fathers and daughters, and Pericles wants to marry the daughter. The Antiochus and his daughter moment in the riddle, and we'll talk about that, and then the Simonides and Thaisa moment, and we'll talk about that. And in both cases, the father, whether it's the wicked father Antiochus who says, uh-oh, he's guessed my secret, he better die, or whether it's Simonides saying to us, I'm just fooling, I just want to test him, I just want to make sure that she really loves him, and so forth, that in both cases, you have to use this rather old-fashioned gesture of the aside because you don't have the soliloquy. You don't have the person talking to himself and giving you that sense of the interior monologue. This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good, or Iago saying, I have it, it is engendered, Helen Knight must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light. You're not inside the mind of the thinker, whether it's the heroic thinker or the doubting thinker or the Machiavellian thinker at the beginning of this play. You don't have your sense of interiority of these characters is not created by that kind of language. Yes, sir?
Or it makes them feel more participant?
You have to, exactly, we, you, us, need to supply that thing, because we are the recipients of these pieces of information. If they don't talk to us, we don't know. It becomes even more like a cartoon. So the audience, and of course, what is the big deal that frames this play, that brings the audience into function?
It's the character
of Gower, yes,
Gower,
right.
who really knits all of the sequences together, gives a verbal bridge in the story pieces, and at the end of the play, reminds the audience that after all, we're the ones who are lending our imagination to this play that make this story work.
So at the end of it's the poet John Gower, or Gore, as many years ago in the Harvard English department, there was a whole business of Gower studies in which everybody called him Gore. Most scholars outside of Harvard call this poet Gower, which is what I'm going to call him. But in any case, the Confessio Amantis, the lover's confession of John Gower, is one of the several sources of this play. And please, I hope you will have read both my chapter and also the prefatory material that talks a little bit about some of these sources and how they're used. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today, I think, talking about that. But in this case, Gower becomes a figure on the stage who is both a narrator and also, I mean, he both invites us into the conversation and asks us to participate in the making of it. Those of you who know Henry V know that the prologues to every act of Henry V function in a relatively similar way, in that in both cases the speaker says, there's something words cannot describe this to you. Gower makes this very evident when he says, action may, the story convey, that words can't do it. It's only action that can do it. He speaks in this archaic, what is it? It's pentameter. He speaks in a four-stress verse, and he's always undercutting the capacity of his own description and suggesting that the narrative that he is speaking is only prefatory to what the actual drama will show. So you have a kind of scrim in front of the play, blocking your way. And this was the point that I wanted to make about the other use of Gower, that on the one hand he invites you in and he makes you a co-partner and he says your imagination is going to make this possible. On the other hand, he's constantly there saying, it's a story, I'm going to tell you a story, I actually can't tell you the really way it ought to be, and so forth. So you have that sort of sense of something in the way of you in the story, at the same time that you have somebody inviting you into it. But in any case, again, theatrically, it may have struck you reading it as a kind of, well, let me not put words in your mouth. Did you find this irritating or charming or both, the figure of Gower? Irritating. Charming. Good for you. Okay, good. Me too. There's a sense, though, in which more than one thing is going on the stage at the same time. And hard to say whether this narrating figure would have always been present on the stage or in any production, or would have been whisked away and been replaced by the drama. But if you think of Gower as the kind of voice-over to a newsreel or something, that is, that you've got one art form, one genre, the genre of poetry without pictures, and verse here, and deliberately archaizing verse, a verse that invents or reuses old words like "e-slaked" for slacked and so forth. This is not language contemporaneous with Shakespeare. You make much of Shakespeare's language may strike you as not contemporaneous with your own, but Gower's language is not contemporaneous with Shakespeare. It is deliberately, it's like when kids do archaic plays and they say "doff" all the time, and what other kinds of words appear archaizing in modern usages? Anon, excellent, excellent. Okay, so it's exactly that stuff. These are the signature words of "I am archaic." It's not that this is a consistently archaic. I mean, you wouldn't go back and actually find this. These are signs of archaism. They're showing their belonging to a different time, and there's a kind of bardic quality to this character, which, among other things, emphasizes the fact that this is a story. So maybe you can kind of relax about it, because somebody is telling you a story. It's not as if with King Lear or Othello You're actually face to face with something inexpressibly terrible, and there's nothing you can do. There's somebody telling you a story. The story might turn out okay. And so there's a kind of prophylactic aspect to Gower as well, kind of keeping you from being harmed by something by returning to both the narrative frame itself and also this archaic language that says not only is it a story, it's an old story. Probably a story that's been told before. Actually, I'm a famous poet. Come here to tell you this story. So there's a lot of apparatus here that signals a certain kind of reception that might take place. Yes?
I think that's true, and I think it's reassuring because it makes us able to tolerate the sort of what appeared to be silliness upon reading it. Well, this is, after all, a tale being told, and so you're immediately distanced from what you're hearing.
Yes, that's right. What struck you as silly?
Well,
The coincidences?
the coincidences and everything just, people dying. And now, I mean, after I thought about it and read what you had to say and others, that in fact they become almost metaphors for rebirth.
Being reborn is an old story and not
Yes,
always silly.
but I didn't see that at first.
I mean,
First time through.
Right. But you know what? It's a woman who dies and is reborn. That's what's part of what I mean. One really could make a very interesting argument about the degree to which female agency takes over in these later plays, because you'll see in The Winter's Tale too, there's a woman who dies and is reborn. Now, the story of dying and being reborn is an old male story authorizing many cultural powerful structures. But in this case, the figure that, and whether it's Christ or it's Lazarus or it's whatever it is, the sublimity of that moment and the unutterability of that moment is here domesticated somehow. And both the death of Faiza lying with simple shells and so forth that surround her with all this stuff, it's domesticated, it's feminized in a certain kind of way that makes the rebirth and the epiphany, that moment, what an epiphany is, it's this kind of confrontation with something that appears and that seems to be religious and transformative. That the epiphany of the return of Faiza is somehow still domesticated. She's among women. Though she's in his absence, please notice that she's found herself a very good political career. That she is the head of she's the head priestess in Ephesus. That she hasn't languished at all. She's the priest of Diana. That these are not actually stories, despite the brothel setting, of female disempowerment, but stories about female empowerment in this fantastic mode. But yes, indeed, the coincidences, the fantasy of never really losing something. Yes, John.
Oh, I was just going to say that when Pericles' father's armor happens to wash ashore just at the moment that he happens to need it, seemed a little fantastic.
Now, of course, if we think that the armor was on board ship with him, then it's not quite so bizarre as it might seem. I mean, if he's traveling with his father's armor and there's a shipwreck, they might, how much armor could there be floating around in the Mediterranean? If they find any armor, they might find his father's if it happens to have been on the boat with him. But nonetheless, this is another kind of reunion. And this is a generational reunion between the father, the father is represented by the armor and by the son. And to go back to Ephesus for a second and the epistle to the Ephesians, you remember the moment in Ephesians in which Paul says, put on the whole armor of God? Is that a passage that any of you are familiar with? It's a passage that was very important to Spencer and is crucial to Book 1 of the Fairy Queen, the Book of Holiness, in which the Red Cross Knight is really pursues a set of adventures, which are very much romance adventures, in which the putting on the armor of God becomes the kind of subtext here. But in this case, this is a very, it's a secular play, it's a popular entertainment and so forth, but nonetheless, finding the father's armor and putting it on and finding yourself empowered here carries with it this sense of Christian agency as well as of paternal power. Yes. First there and then here.
Getting back to the archaizing effect of Gower, another element in his appearance is in several instances, a dumb show.
Yes.
And I was reminded very strongly of the play within the play in Hamlet.
Of course.
And I was trying to just calibrate what theatrical era is this alluding to? Is this like the late 16th century, or what style is Shakespeare giving us? It's certainly not the style of his own plays. It's a different style.
Yeah. The history of the dumb show is a long history. It often functions, as it does in Hamlet, in counterpoint to what is then about to be performed in language. And of course, one of the things about the dumb show in Hamlet, as people have analyzed it, is that it corresponds in some ways, but not entirely, with what is performed in the play within the play that we see, and in the play of Hamlet, to which both allude, and that the tensions between, the differences between what is left out in the dumb show that is presented in speech, or how, when you see a dumb show and you interpret it, and then you find out what they were saying, you have to revise what it is that you thought you saw. Partly the dumb show is, historically speaking, like a shadow play, or like a pre-play, a way precisely of providing a pre-narrative, and a pre-narrative for an only partially literate audience of what's about to happen. It's kind of a snapshot. It's like an abstract of something. First you see it, and then you see it again. You see it in a more expanded way with language. So it has a long history of, how long? It has some years of history of performance here. But certainly it functions in this play as another archaizing move. Absolutely. No. Please.
Just something that I always find fascinating too is that dumb shows are very important for the political arena at this time, that kings and high-ranking politicians would actually act out dumb shows for the benefit of the populace as ways of making explicitly clear what's happening. So at this time period, for instance, it's fascinating to think about, I believe it was James and the Spanish ambassador acting out a dumb show when they sign a treaty, for instance, in very much the same choreographical fashion as a dumb show would have happened on Shakespeare's stage.
Thank you. And that makes it not unlike today's photo ops, for example, that you sign a treaty. Well, look at this morning's Times, where you have the entente, whatever it is, between the Palestinian ambassador and the Israeli ambassador. Who knows how many times they tried to get them into the same frame, and where George Bush is with respect to that if he's the Gower figure, so to speak, or making this dumb show function. But the photo op often, replaces or emblematizes for the audience, in this case, the people who are watching it as a news item, either still or moving, emblematizes this moment of history. And you're right, that it's a kind of translation device, it's a kind of quotation, it's a signal, it's both memorialization and also an anticipation of something. So it's both before and after, in a way. And it is high as well as low. Thank you, Mel, very much for that. Yes, I'm sorry. Please.
I was actually going to mention the dumb show as well, that it's the third way of telling you what is about to happen. And by doing that, it plants seeds that, to some extent, I mean, the story is somewhat preposterous, has a lot of coincidences. And by planting the seeds in this ancient text, you are sort of concentrating on the way the story is being told to you. And it sort of does away with that, well, this can't possibly happen.
I think that's very well observed. I think that's right. That the first time you hear about it, you think, that's ridiculous. Second time you think, well, that was unusual, but maybe it was convincing. And the third time you think, well, that's what happened. I'm oversimplifying here, but you're right, that it conditions you to impossibility as a conceptual possibility. Aristotle famously said that he would prefer for drama a probable impossibility to an improbable possibility. Yes?
And Disney changed that. He said he preferred a plausible impossibility in a cartoon to a possible implausibility.
Well, I didn't know that he said that, and that's very interesting. But cartoons are a very good example of exactly this kind of thing, where pigs don't fly or talk or whatever it is, but that you get into the language of what's happening. It becomes a convention. It becomes naturalized. You think, oh, the father's armor. Well, that's interesting. Oh, the returned wife, the returned daughter. Well, I mean, after a while, this repetition of finding the lost one, or first the lost fragment, and then increasingly the whole one, because you get the armor without the father in it, and then you get the daughter, but too bad about the lost mother, and then finally the mother returns, and so forth. You have, again, this little moment of this, one of the few moments in which the wife returns, and you get the whole domestic family for a little moment, and again, one of the few moments in which when the wife returns, the child is female, that the progeny here functions in a way that produces a female line. Now, again, James had a marriageable daughter whose marriage was the occasion for several of these productions, either originally or in re-performance, so that one of the political signals being sent here is indeed the idea of marriage and dynasty through the female line. That the daughter is the bearer of the history, and she marries a powerful king or governor or whatever, and they go off and rule someplace while the parents retreat to a place of previous location. We'll see the same thing happens in The Tempest, where Prospero does not get his wife back, and we'll talk about the absence of Prospero's wife, but where Miranda and Ferdinand go off and rule in Naples, and he goes back to Milan, where he came from. Every third thought will be his grave. So this is again part of the narrative. But this question of the naturalization of the impossible or the implausible is crucially important. Thank you very much for bringing up the dumb show, both of you. I think that's very, very helpful. So you have, as you say, three frames. You've got Gower, you've got the dumb show, then you've got the play itself, and then within the play you have the early scenes, almost surely not by Shakespeare, though there's some discussion about the fisherman scene, which is so good it ought to be by Shakespeare, even if it isn't, as people often say. And then the latter parts of the play that seem to be very, very powerfully reminiscent, at least, and recognizable as Shakespearean language and Shakespearean action and Shakespearean kinds of characters. So that you have here also a kind of evolution. You have that three layers, so to speak, in the course of the play itself. So that this is the kind of reading that one would make, for example, if I were talking about the cult of ruins in the late 18th, early 19th century, or about the cult of the fragment in the 20th century or something. And the way in which a ruin was for certain romantic writers and critics and so forth, more powerful than it would be if the whole temple had stood, or that finding a fragment of a poem or a fragment of a painting somehow is more evocative or powerful than if you had the whole thing here. So also the fact that this play is not certifiably and entirely by Shakespeare makes it, in a way, a more interesting artifact, partly because it performs in its own writing history something of this layering and something of this versioning that we've been talking about. And again, the kind of key way you might look at this is to look at those opening scenes with the incest and the post-incest, and then see how Shakespeare turns it into the story of the family romance, that he renaturalizes this idea of incest, because incest, of course, at the beginning of the play is an irredeemable secret, and it's a secret that is a secret to whom? Who doesn't know about the incest? The suitors don't know. The suitors don't know, and principally Pericles. For a long time, he doesn't know. I mean, we know, and yes, we know. We've heard sorry, no, it's Steve. It's Steve himself speaking to us, telling us that we have just a few minutes to close down and then to start again. The incest riddle, let's look at the incest riddle just for a second because it's so wonderful. It doesn't have to be written by Shakespeare to be wonderful. I think a lot of these things are simply fabulous. Okay, so we are in Act 1, Scene 1. That's where you would find a riddle. So let me also just say something about the genre of the riddle. That there's a way in which a play like this itself functions as a riddle. That it is, a riddle functions as an impossibility where you have to figure out what could make it actually true. It's a mysterious saying that when you analyze it, you begin to understand how it functions. And here's Pericles, right? And you have to understand, you have to imagine, I mean, the Pericles of these earlier scenes is not a genius. Really, there are a lot of things he doesn't get, and his not getting them are important to our understanding them and also understanding, because of what I said a little bit earlier about the resistance to interiority in some of these characters, that you don't see him thinking to himself, now let me see. You don't sort of see the inside this moment. So here's Pericles reading the riddle. I am no viper, yet I feed on mother's flesh, which did me breed. I sought a husband, in which labor I found that kindness in a father. He's father, son, and husband mild, I, mother, wife, and yet his child. How they may be, and yet in two, as you will live, resolve it, you. So, you consider this a hard riddle? When you read it, did you think to yourself, what in the world could this mean? Speak? No, okay. Now, again, try to imagine the obverse riddle. Try to imagine three persons in one. Try to imagine father, son, ghost. Try to imagine a kind of riddle which is holy rather than unholy, which is a mystery of a transcendent kind rather than a mystery of a fleshly and bodily kind. Part of the power of this comes from it being the anti-type of a religious moment. That this is the opposite of that. And I think with this we will stop for a second, then we'll come back to the riddle. And I want to look particularly in the next hour that we have together at the scenes of recognition and discovery in this play, which are simply astonishing. So let's take 5 minutes and then we'll come back. Okay, so I want to go back to where we had stopped, that is to this discussion of the riddle. And I want to insist for a second, just polemically, on its sort of anti-Christological quality, on the degree to which this story about the being in too many different relationships is a carnal one rather than a spiritual one, that the demonized figure is the female here, that the incest riddle, which was also, we won't forget, one of Oedipus's problems, is here constellated around female transgression and female sexual over-availability, and that this is the secret that the father has, Antiochus has, and that Pericles, as we saw, was beginning to try to figure out when he was reading the riddle. And he sees that he is in danger. And what does he do? How does he respond to his reading of the riddle? Yes?
Well, he sort of tries to evade actually coming out with the answer,
Yep.
because he can see that would probably be a disaster. And so he hints at the fact that he knows the answer and tries to beg off.
Right. And ultimately he's trapped in, I mean, knowledge, as so often, is a problem. He can't get rid of the knowledge that he has. Antiochus says he has found the meaning, and he understands that Pericles is going to be a danger to him. And so the only way for, so Pericles, from being in love with this, notice that she's nameless. Notice that the daughter of Antiochus is nameless. That again, she's not even a type. She's a kind of a fantasy. She's an object of carnal desire. And she's his first object of carnal desire. And going all the way back to Romeo and Juliet, for example, we often see that there is a gesture toward an object before you actually know what it means like to be really in love. So the second time around, so he flees Antioch and winds up in Tarsus. Tarsus, yes. And it's there that he encounters, as if it's a dream, the same scenario. There's a father and a daughter, and the daughter is available to get married. And I mean, so you have the same thing happen all over again, but in a different language, in a different frame. If it were a cutout, it would be in a different color. Now she has a name. The father, rather than pretending he wants the suitor, pretends he doesn't want the suitor. But you have really the same thing staged all over again. The reason I want to draw attention to this is partly because it points forward toward that third moment of father-daughter love, which is the Pericles reunion with Marina moment, which, remember where it takes place. I mean, what Marina is employed in a brothel, even though they've trotted her out of the brothel. She's now a kind of tutor, governess, or whatever she is. But she's not completely removed from this world of the carnal, though she removes herself from it and converts them out of it. But there's a third repetition here, and it's a repetition with a difference. And so the point I'm making is a fairly obvious one here. It's not only about repetitions and fairy tales and so forth. It's about how a playwright, let's call him Shakespeare, might take some materials that he's working with that are kind of rough though charming and rework them thematically into something that is more profound or more moving or more compelling. That rather than sort of saying, this is kind of dumb, or this is kind of obvious, or this is kind of crass, or whatever it is, it utilizes those materials as if this were, sedimentary rock, that you see the various layers here, that it utilizes those earlier materials and it converts them. And indeed, the initial playwright or playwrights of these opening scenes does the conversion himself, that going from Antiochus and his daughter and the riddle to, so the riddle is really sort of, what's the right place for parental love? What is the moment when it turns transgressive? What is the moment when it's possessive? What is the moment when you have to say no? These are, the riddle is not merely a riddle about a secret. It's also a riddle about the possibility of relationship and about categories and resistances and the power of both love and desire. And as crude as this riddle is, that even Pericles can understand what it's about, it does subtend the whole play. This question about boundaries and love does subtend the whole play. So, and before you think you're going to get Thaisa back, when it seems as if things are complete with the reunion of the father and the daughter, and indeed if it were King Lear, you would say it was complete with the reunion of Lear and Cordelia. You wouldn't look around and say, where's Mrs. Lear? It's at that moment that, again, happily for the play and its return to everyday life, both a husband for Marina and a wife for Pericles will somehow magically or circumstantially be provided. So that the father-daughter reunion is the beginning of a return to life and relationship and the everyday and the dynastic, not as Lear and Cordelia fantasized, that they would be like birds in a cage singing to one another, and that they would live a fantasy life in which they looked constantly into one another's eyes as a kind of parental-daughterly dyad. Yes?
Thanks. Just one embellishment on what you were saying.
Please.
I was thinking about the scene where Marina is brought to her father as somebody who's going to get him out of his depression, sort of.
Exactly.
And basically what she says is, I'm your daughter. And if you think about what maybe previous incest, where the father forgets that the daughter is the daughter, and she basically says, "I'm your daughter."
Right, right.
And I thought that was really powerful. And
That's
then
great.
it's sort of an undoing of the repetition.
That's great.
Stop.
That's great. And it's such a wonderful, wonderful scene. And I want to talk about it, but first I want to talk about just one more scene. I want to talk about the birth of Marina and the shipwreck and the death of Thaisa, and then come to this scene. But you're right. She is in the position of the analyst. Absolutely. He is dysfunctional. He's let his hair grow. He is, won't speak to anybody, won't listen to anybody, won't talk to anybody. He's in a kind of traumatic, catatonic situation in which they say, oh, she's a miracle worker. So oh no, nobody can fix him. He is beyond hope. Well, let's just try. Let's just kind of bring him into the aura of this person. But it's true, and what she does is she gets him to speak. And she gets him to speak by asking him these kinds of questions, by posing him, and I say this in my chapter again, another set of riddles. The riddle of her name, the riddle of her being born at sea, of being of no country because she's born at sea, and so forth, that she cures the bad riddle by the good riddle. She cures his anomie by curiosity. It's a wonderfully...
By real knowledge.
Sorry?
By real knowledge.
Well, by recognition. But because she doesn't, it's not that she tells him anything he doesn't know. She tells him a set of things, and this is very romance-like, that he recognizes, or he half recognizes, or he doesn't dare to recognize. And that sort of slow pulling of the curtain away about called Marina because she's born at sea, what country, of no country, that little bits and pieces of information, it's as if he had been ill, as he had been, and could not eat a whole meal at once, but is being given little bits and pieces at a time until he is able to eat on his own. That is, he's just giving him just enough information, stage by stage, to come out. You can see him awakening, just as Thaisa awakens from the casket. It's an extraordinary moment, but I think it's not only information, it's recognition. Remember, the word recognition means to know again. It's cognition plus read. So, and in a way, all cognition is recognition, because if you didn't, if it didn't make sense to you, you couldn't incorporate it in some way. So that when Pericles reads the incest riddle to begin with, he recognizes it, not because he's committed incest, but because it is a cultural formation that makes some sense to him. And so his cognition is a kind of recognition. And in the case of this, what is often called a recognition scene between the father and the daughter, she allows him to re-know something and to re-know someone. And that recognition, which is a repetition, is a sign of the fact that cognition is always a kind of repetition. That in order to understand it, it needs to match up with something that you already know, like the famous moment in the Helen Keller movie about when she begins to understand what the word water means, that it's not just a word that is spelled out, but that it actually corresponds to something in the world. And Marina gives him back a correspondence with the world. And this is to make it a slightly more mystical. It's not the normal way that I would talk about it, but I think that is functionally partly what's happening. Let's look at the play. Let's look for a second at the death of Thaisa in the storm, and at then the discovery of her body by and restoration of her body by the very well named magician Saramon, or physician Saramon. So where are we? We're in Act 3, scenes 1 and 2, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So Pericles is on shipboard in Act 1. Notice that Marina is accompanied by Lycorida. And who is Lycorida? She's the nurse. She's the nursemaid. She's going to be part of the ultimate recognition scene, and she's also the foster mother, the foster mother that makes the point about foster parenting and parenting again. Later on in the play. So he's on shipboard, and he's in the middle of the storm, and here again, I want to emphasize the degree to which this play works with images in a different way from the tragedies that we've been looking at. And I think I probably underscore this a good deal in the chapters that I've asked you to read, but let me just say it out loud as well, that where in the tragedies that we've been looking at, images are metaphorical by and large. The jealousy, the green-eyed monster, or the doubtful it stood like two spent swimmers that did cling together and choke their art at the beginning of Macbeth, where the it in the doubtful it stood is the battle and the outcome of the battle, that you have this mental picture of these two exhausted swimmers pulling each other down. In these romances, by and large, that not entirely, but to a certain extent, that metaphorical language drops out and is replaced by action. It's as if you had a green-eyed monster on stage. It's as if you had the two exhausted swimmers on stage. That what is accomplished by magical images within discourse in the tragedies is to a certain extent expanded and opened up so that it becomes, again, the plausible impossibility of the image walking around on stage here, of which, again, the incest is one example. But here we have a storm, which is both an emotional storm and also a physical and physiological storm. And it's out of this storm that the baby is born. And so I want you to look first at Act 3, Scene 1, about line, about line 45, where the sailors begin to say, "We have to throw your wife overboard. She's dead. Sir, your queen must overboard. The sea works high, the wind is loud, will not lie till the ship be cleared of the dead." So that's your superstition, he says. "Pardon us, sir, with us at sea it hath been still observed, and we are strong in custom." Now that's a line that you could find almost any place in a Shakespearean play about the difference between superstition and custom. "Therefore briefly yield her, for she must overboard straight. As you think meet, most wretched queen." And now he addresses what he thinks to be the dead body of the queen. "A terrible childbed hast thou had, my dear, no light, no fire. The unfriendly elements forgot thee utterly, nor have I time to give thee hallowed to thy grave, but straight must cast thee, scarcely coffined, in the ooze, where for a monument upon thy bones, and ere remaining lamps, the belching whale and humming water must o'erwhelm thy corpse, lying with simple shells." Now, this little picture of underwater life and of the friendliness somehow of underwater life is a picture that we'll see again in the song that Ariel sings to Ferdinand in The Tempest, "Full fathom 5, thy father lies." These are pearls that were his eyes, and so forth. And that is horrifically present early on in a Shakespearean play in Clarence's Dream in Richard III, in this underwater nightmare of being eaten alive by creatures. But in this case, these are friendly creatures that somehow participate in the obsequies here. "Liquor bring Nestor, bring me spices, ink and paper, my casket and my jewels." So he's going to surround her with artifacts that tell who she is and that will be signs of recognition. And almost anybody knowing any fairy tale is going to know that these things are not going to disappear forever. They're going to come back and be read and be interpreted. "Sir, we have a chest beneath the hatches, caulked and bitumen ready." I thank the mariner here. The hopefulness of Pericles really is shown always in his capacity to move sideways, to move metonymically, so forth, sideways to yet another island where something good might happen. So he's done a good deed for Cleon and Dionysa. You may remember that he came to them and they thought he was going to be bringing weaponry and to overrun their starved land. Instead, he brings food, and so he thinks that he can claim a favor of them, and he brings them now on the second go-round. And here we could think about Coriolanus and the cry for food and so forth. He brings them his daughter to bring up. Now, what's the problem with as we're about to find out, I mean, even though we're going to look at this next scene, what happens to Marina off stage as we are about to watch the rebirth on stage of Thaisa? Why are Cleon and Dionysa not good foster parents for Marina? Yes?
Well, Dionysa decides that she's a competitor with her daughter when when she grows up, and orders her killed.
Right. So we learn that they have a daughter. The daughter, Philoten. The daughter's name is Philoten, and it's going to be a rivalry situation. Again, if we're not unfamiliar with this structure of the foster child, the sibling rivalry, the real child over the real, the child of these parents being overwhelmed by the appearance of the foster child who outshines them and so forth. And these people who the first time we met them seemed to us to be wonderfully hospitable, needy, thankful folks, now turn out to be total monsters, especially the wife. I mean, so interesting that in the course of the text, as you will have noticed, both of them get blamed for this, and both of them get punished for this. But it's the wife, it's this awful wife, or this protective mother, let us call her, Dionysa, who hatches the plan. I mean, it's a little snapshot of the Lady Macbeth scenario. She urges the husband to do something. He is reluctant. She says, no, we have to do it. For the sake of our daughter, we have to do this thing. We have to kill her, really? Well, yes, we do. We have to kill her for the sake of our daughter. And so, again, you may think it's unrealistic. It's a kind of a snapshot from an earlier Shakespearean moment, but it also, it brings out that question of the rivalry of the two daughters that is thematic in almost every Shakespearean comedy. Manifestly in As You Like It, also to a certain extent in Much Ado About Nothing, the comparison between the two daughters. I mean, if you look about Much Ado, once again, you've got the silent daughter hero, who's the biological child of Leontes, and the cousin, Beatrice, who is the one who overshadows and speaks. So in the background, we're going to have this drama taking place, but in the foreground of the play, we're going to have the arrival now of the casket here in the hands of Ephesus. Again, Ephesus, the place where magic happens, the place where they did use magic arts, the place inhabited by sorcerers. In St. Paul, the concern is that these are evil sorcerers, that these are that this is a negative kind of magic rather than a powerful kind of magic. But in this case, Lord Cerimon, who is a physician and a learned man, and again, a kind of snapshot, perhaps, or foretaste of the kind of transcendent figure that Prospero will be in The Tempest, is knowledgeable in arts and medicine. Let's just look at this passage for a second because it's very suggestive. About line 26 in Act 3, Scene 2. I hold it ever virtue and cunning were endowments greater than nobleness and riches. Now, cunning here means knowledge. It's from the same word as con, to learn something by heart. This is not dissimulation cunning. Careless airs may the two latter darken and expend, but immortality attends the former, making a man a god. Now, in most Shakespearean instances, this would be a very dangerous thing to say. But here it's knowledge, not the desire for riches or nobleness, that makes a man a god. So this is a humanist statement, a statement about man a little lower than the angels, through knowledge, through scholarship, through learning. 'Tis known I ever have studied physic, through which secret art, by turning o'er authorities, I have, together with my practice, made familiar to me and to my aid the blessed infusions that dwell in vegetives, in metals, stones. So here we have both this description of a kind of medical practice and a kind of semi-magical practice, and also carefully overlaid with virtue and with good religiosity. Can speak of the disturbances that nature works and of her cures, which doth give me, so again, here we talked a little bit before about how Marina is going to serve this function. She's going to be a lay analyst and a lay doctor in the second half of the play. Here we have a professional doctor who's a man who has learning and training and a cabinet full of herbs and things that he's able to use, which doth give me a more content in course of true delight than to be thirsty after a tottering honor, or tie my treasure up in silken bags to please the fool and death. In other words, to be a miser or a hoarder of money. The fool and death often in woodcuts of this period are either versions of the same. The antic death shows up in Richard II as a figure where Shakespeare conflates the two. Your honor has through Ephesus poured forth your charity. I just want you to notice again the way in which this magical physician figure is overlarded with words like charity and blessed and so forth, lest you think that this is bad magic. These things of burnt Lord Cerimon, such strong renown as time shall never raise, and now in come the chest. Here comes this thing on which he's going to be working his magic, and they open it, and instead of smelling like rotten flesh, it smells wonderful. It smells most sweetly in my sense, a delicate odor as ever hit my nostrils. So up with it, O you most potent gods, what's here? A corpse, most strange, shrouded in cloths of state, bombed and entreasured with full bags of spices. A passport, too. Now, this is not today's passport. This is a piece of writing that explains something. But this word passport, what does passport mean, literally? What is it? It's a letter of introduction, and it allows you to cross over from one place to another, as from one nation or one jurisdiction to another. Hamlet uses the word here. But interestingly, this passport is going to allow her to cross over in the way that Hamlet was never able to make it, from death back into life again. But what's literally meant here is just a piece of writing, a piece of description here. Apollo, perfect me in the characters, help me read the characters. And here we have a piece of forgettable verse. Here I give to understand, if ere this coffin drives a land, I, King Pericles, have lost this queen worth all our mundane cost. Who finds her, give her burying, she was the daughter of a king. Besides this treasure for a fee, the gods requite his charity. And you would think that this would be the end of it. But it isn't 2 lines before Cerimon says, no, wait a second. She's not dead. Look how fresh she looks. They were too rough that threw her in the sea. Make a fire within, fetch hither all my boxes in my closet. Death may usurp on nature many hours, and yet the fire of life kindle again the o'er-expressed spirits. And again, this is a not unfamiliar Shakespearean phenomenon, where somebody looks as if they are dead, and then turn out, in fact, to be alive. I heard of an Egyptian that had 9 hours lying dead, who was by good appliance recovered. Appliance meaning the applying of cloths and so forth. This isn't like a Maytag. This is the applying of things. Well said, the fire and claws, that still and woeful music that we have, cause it to sound, beseech you. And here, what I partly want to remind you of is that at this moment of magical transformation, as in, let us say, the awakening of King Lear, you do me wrong to take me out of the grave, there is music, there is darkness, there are odors, good odors, there's the herbs burning and so forth, but music attends upon the transformation and upon the reawakening and upon the rebirth here. Vile once more, how thou stirrest, thou block. Now, this is a comment, of course, to the servant here, that you're not doing the right thing. The music there, I pray you give her air. Gentlemen, this queen will live. Nature awakes a warm breath out of her. She hath not been entranced above 5 hours. See how she begins to blow into life's flower again. Well, this is about as metaphorical as this play is going to get. This is a metaphor. She is a natural object. She's been a flower, she's been a jewel, she's been something in the casket, but now she is going to be returning to the cycle of nature. She is alive, says Cerimon. Behold her eyelids, cases to those heavenly jewels which Pericles hath lost, begin to part their fringes of bright gold. And here you might want to remember that moment in King Lear, where the anonymous gentleman in Act 4 is describing Cordelia's response to the story about her father, where her smiles and tears were like sunshine and rain at once, and the tears dropping from her eyes were like pearls from diamonds dropped. This is the same language. The diamonds of a most praised water doth appear to make the world twice rich. Live and make us weep to hear your fate, fair creature, rare as you seem to be. Notice Thaisa's first words, "Oh, dear Diana." So that she's going to turn out to be the priestess of Diana is already here dramatically foreordained. Where am I? Where is my Lord? What world is this? And again, these are questions. These are riddling questions. These are questions that anticipate the questions that we're going to hear in the exchange between Pericles and Marina, and again in the second recognition scene between Pericles and Thaisa. In this case, these are real questions, so to speak. That is to say, she'd like to know the answer to them. But the fact that they are posed as questions and that they are in these short, plain lines of verse, that it's verse, but and they're very direct, but still, these are unvarnished questions, and the fact that they're questions, not answers, is important to the structure of the play, because the riddle as question, the question as riddle, the necessity of finding answers as recognition will again inform the rest of the structure of the play. Is this not strange? Most rare. Hush, my gentle neighbors, lend me your hands. Now this matter must be looked to, for her relapse is mortal, meaning again that she will die if she relapses here. Come, come, and Aesculapius guide us. So again, this is the classical god of medicine. So you have built into this play, as so often with Shakespeare, the combination of Christian and classical references, but Saruman very much protected by the language surrounding him against any idea that this is black magic, that these are mystical arts. He has studied, he has learned, he forswears the idea of wealth or power or social visibility. What he wants is knowledge and healing. Aesculapius be our guide. So this is the moment of the first reawakening, so to speak. And then the action will take us to show us what has happened to Marina, and the comparison between Marina and Philoten, and the narrative that we have discussed already about how she gets into the brothel and how she gets out of the brothel, that she's a completely unsatisfactory whore. Not only won't she do it, but she convinces them all that really they're wasting their time, that I'm out of the way of writing forever. Come, let us hear the Vestals sing. And again, that might strike you as merely a comic thing to say, except that the idea of the Vestals and the Vestal virgins are going to return in the figure of Thaisa, because, of course, what's become of her? Tucked in at the end of Act 3, we have a little scene between Saruman and Thaisa, in which now she's well enough to chat with the physician, Saruman, and he says, matter this letter and some jewels, lay with you in your coffer, which are at your command, know you this character, and so forth. And she says, character's handwriting. Character in this, as in writing characters. It is my lord's, she remembers this, but since King Pericles, my wedded lord, I ne'er shall see again, a vestal livery will I take me to, and never more have joy. And he says, well, actually, you're right near the Temple of Diana. Why don't I just take you there? And this is the other, location in Ephesus, is that Diana is indeed one of the resident goddesses in Ephesus. So you have the Christian Ephesus of St. Paul, very much invoked and evoked here, and you also have the classical Ephesus, the place of Diana's temple. And notice how quickly and completely they assume that Pericles is gone forever, and she's going to go on to her next thing, which is to become a Vestal Virgin. Again, she is not, I want to emphasize this too, she is going into an all-female world, but she is not turning her back on the world. This is not really the same thing as Friar Lawrence saying about Juliet, I'll dispose of her in a nunnery, or Aegean saying to Hermia, either you can die the death or you can live a barren sister all your life, chanting faint hymns to the cold, fruitless moon. If you don't marry the guy I tell you to marry, you can either die right away or you can have a kind of living death in a nunnery. This is not that. Yes?
What is Diana the goddess of?
Chastity. And she is the twin sister of Apollo. Yes, and she's a huntress, absolutely. But she is, but she is the goddess of chastity. And again, chastity is a positive virtue here, not chastity as abstinence, not chastity as turning, she's not the goddess of the Isabella of the opening scenes in Measure for Measure. She's the goddess of a kind of empowered chastity, that is to say, a kind of female agency that is alone and by itself. Yes?
I actually wanted to ask you about Diana here, because first time I think it's a strange relationship between Thaisa and Diana. She swears that by Diana that she will not marry any of those suitors of the knights, basically, and then she marries immediately. So she kind of deceives or betrays Diana. And I thought Diana is also a patron of birth, of labor, helps in labor.
That's right. Yes.
And
childbirth.
And first I read it, I thought, okay, now she dies, maybe because of that.
Right.
And then it turns out it's just the first time that Diana is involved with her, and then again it reappears in a very different mode for her. So when she, like you read it right now, then when she awakens, first thing she asks, "Oh, Diana, where I am?"
Right.
So I couldn't, I found it difficult to put it all together, if there is any sense in all that.
Well, let us say that Diana is her patron, that she, from the very beginning of the play, identifies herself with Diana. And again, Diana is not necessarily about never marrying. As you say, she's also, paradoxically, we might think, the protectress of childbirth here. But in the scene that we didn't talk about, the scene of the various suitors of Thaisa, it's like the suitors of Portia, or I mean, these are anti-suitors that are meant by contrast to. And how do they differ from Pericles? Pericles is suffering. He is meritorious. They're all handsome and well tricked out, and they haven't had to work a day in their lives. He has suffered privation. He has been shipwrecked. He's wearing a rusty armor. People make fun of him. His impresa says, "I still hope," and it's a little twig with a little leaf at the end of it, and so forth. That as in all fairy tales, she has to choose, as in even the fairy tale of the casket choice. Bassanio has to choose the least promising casket, the lead one rather than the gold one. She has to choose inside rather than outside. She has to choose the man rather than the apparatus here. So, and she also has to do that thing that we saw Desdemona do and that we see Portia do, that is to become aggressive with respect to the father's wishes in saying, "This is the man I choose. I want this one. I do want to marry, and I want this one." Where the sense is that she has fallen in love, that she has found her perfect mate, whatever it is. But that we're going through stages here, and you could say that she's moving from the one Diana to the other Diana, and then back to the first Diana, if you like, from the virginal Diana to the childbirth Diana, which may well be the one that she is remembering as she awakens here, since last time she was conscious she was giving birth, but also that she's moving toward the temple of Diana in all of her aspects, which she is going herself to represent. So I don't think that insofar as it's inconsistent, it's just because of Diana's various avatars, not, I think, because there's any moment when Thaisa is un-Diana-like.
What I also found difficult, why did she have to swear? Because, well, in other places in Shakespeare, when somebody mentions God or when God is involved somehow, and here she swears by her and immediately betrays this oath. Why does she have to?
Let's find the passage so that we can answer your question, okay?
I think it's Act 2, Scene 5. Just in the very beginning, it's about line 7.
"1 12-month more she'll wear Diana's livery," she says. So he says, that she says, nights my daughter says she's not going to marry for 12 months. That's the message. Think of Juliet lying to the nurse and saying, who's that guy, who's that guy, who's that guy, when they actually want it to be Romeo. Think of Juliet lying to her parents. Thaisa here is sending a message. Send those suitors away, I don't want to marry. But she's not swearing by Diana. The father's invoking Diana here. And, no?
This by the eye of Cynthia has she vowed, and on her virgin honor will not break it.
Yeah, but who's saying that? That's the father
That's
says.
the father, yeah.
Father says, the daughter says this. That's very different from the daughter says this. The father is the one who is invoking Diana and Cynthia, who's a virgin, etc. The daughter says to the father, I don't want to marry. Father delivers and embellishes the message. She's not going to marry. She's going to be Diana's whatever it is. So she is. Ironically, this comes true. She is going to wear Diana's livery and so forth, not in the way that he understands it. But it's not that there's not a blasphemy on her part, misusing the name of Diana. This is the father quoting, embellishing, citing, paraphrasing what he thinks the daughter said to him, when in fact both he and she know what she is really up to, that she actually is marrying not one of those guys, but somebody else. And Simonides takes us aside periodically and says, I'm really glad this is happening. Lest we think that the heavy father is really being heavy. But in fact, I think this is perfectly consistent, because what happens here is that she does wear Diana's livery at the end of her life, where she didn't wear it in this early moment. And she wears it because she becomes a priestess of Diana. So let me bring you, if we can, to these two unbelievable scenes that I really want us to be sure to remember. One of which is the awakening of Pericles. Now, we've just talked about the awakening of Thaisa. Now we're going to talk about the awakening of Pericles, who is similarly dead. He's absolutely as dead as she. He is also living a living dead life. His hair is growing. He's not talking to anybody. He's not interacting with anybody. He has opted out of life. He is living a death in life. And he has taken this vow about not cutting his hair and so forth. But he is functioning. He's dysfunctional. He's functioning in a way that is like death in life. And in fact, if you were to go to the Ancient Mariner, you would find exactly a figure like this in Coleridge's poetic imagination. And they say nobody can fix him. Absolutely nobody can fix him. Let's start here at Act 5, Scene 1, line 24. The speaker is Helicanus, who is one of those old retainer figures that we've become very familiar with. The old man who is trustworthy and the surrogate whom he has left briefly in command of the land, and who's then been sent after him, because remember, there's some exigency in trying to deal with Pericles here. Sir, our vessel is of Tyre, Eneth the king, a man who for these 3 months hath not spoken to anyone, nor take sustenance, but to prorogue his grief, to prolong his grief. Upon what ground is his distemperature? And the interlocutor here is Lysimachus, the governor of Mytilene, and what will be the husband, finally, of Marina. The main grief springs from the loss of a beloved daughter and a wife. May we not see him, you may, but there's no point. He will not speak to any. Yet let me obtain my wish, says Lysimachus, because he's the governor, this is going to happen. Pericles discovered, that is to say, they reveal him, whether he is hidden behind something, whether there's a curtain or something, that he is now revealed, and he's revealed in his privative state, with his long hair, with his unkempt. He is mourning, but his mourning is such that it is a kind of mourning that is also a kind of melancholia, that has incorporated death in life. It is in vain, he will not speak to you. We have a maid in Mytilene who would word some words of him. Good idea, says Lysimachus, well bethought. She, questionless, I love questionless here, that means without question, but of course it's going to be with lots of questions. With her sweet harmony and other chosen attractions, would allure and make a battery through his deafened ports, which now are midway stopped. So this is now described as his ears and eyes are like ports to the body. They say, well, it's pointless, all effectless, yet nothing will omit that bears recovery's name. Will try this. And Helicanus here, I'm moving out of line 60-61, they want to know what is the story of your king's sorrow. Sir, I will recount it to you, but see, I am prevented. And what I want you to notice here is that this is a repetition of what Gower does. That somebody's going to tell you, no, we're going to show you. That over and over again in this play, telling is replaced by showing. Enter Lord from the barge with Marina. Here's the lady, and they describe her, and then she sings. And again, so it's again, music is part of this moment of transformation. And here now at line 85. He's resistant. Hum ha, he doesn't want to talk to her. I am a maid, my lord, that ne'er before invited eyes, but have been gazed on like a comet. I never asked anybody to look at me before. People have stared at me. She speaks, my lord, that maybe hath endured a grief might equal yours, if both were justly weighed. Though wayward fortune did malign my state, my derivation was from ancestors who stood equivalent with mighty kings. Now this is, again, a typical romance thing. Ordinary person turns out to be royal. We'll see this in later Shakespearean romances as well. Freud thinks of this as a fantasy. This is part of one of Freud's notions about the family romance, that I'm not an ordinary person, I'm a highborn person. The word romance is well taken in the phrase family romance. This is precisely a family romance. But as with all of these actual romances in the Renaissance, it turns out that the lowborn is highborn. My derivation was from ancestors who stood equivalent with mighty kings. But time hath rooted out my parentage, and to the world and awkward casualties bound me in servitude. So I have fallen low. Aside, I will desist, but there is something glows upon my cheek and whispers in mine ear, go not till he speak. So here we do have a little moment of interiority or intuition. And Pericles, who, remember, doesn't listen or speak, is beginning to take fragments of what she has said. My fortunes, parentage, good parentage, to equal mine. Was it not thus? What say you? I said, my lord, if you did know my parentage, you would not do me violence. I do think so, he says. Pray you, turn your eyes upon me. You're like something that, what countrywoman, here of these shores? No, when he says you're like something that, what does he recognize? What does he? His wife. His wife. And arguably, the actress or actor playing Marina is the same as the actor or actress who played Thaisa in the first half of the play 14 years ago. So the recognition could be meta-theatrical as well as theatrical. But in any case, he sees in her something like his wife. Or himself, maybe. Who knows? What countrywoman here of these shores? No, nor of any shores. So, riddle again. But lest you think again that it's magic, we have the explanation of the riddle. Yet I was mortally brought forth and am no other than I appear. So don't think I'm magical. I'm just a riddle. I am great with woe and shall deliver weeping. So what's happened to Pericles here? What does it mean to be great with woe and to deliver? What kinds of language is this? It's pregnancy. It's pregnancy. This is male pregnancy. This is not unknown in the period. Interestingly, poets often, Sidney has a famous sonnet in which he talks about himself as being great with child and yet difficult to speak. You know, fool said my muse to me, speak in my, look in my heart and write. That the idea of writing or of poetical creation is sometimes by male authors in this period thought of as a kind of childbirth. But here we have male childbirth, where previously we had female childbirth. And what's going to be born here is woe, not a child. My dearest wife was like this maid, and such a one my daughter might have been. My queen's square brows, her stature to an inch, as wand-like straight, as silver-voiced, her eyes as jewel-like, and cased as richly. In pace another Juno. So we've switched from Diana to Juno here, the queen of the gods, and the wife of Jupiter, who starves the ears she feeds and makes them hungry the more she gives them speech. And where have we heard that language before? She makes hungry where most she satisfies? Cleopatra. So now suddenly we have the same language that was used for someone culturally and erotically insatiable, as well as the cynosure of all eyes here, describing this virginal figure of Marina. Where do you live? Where I am but a stranger. From the deck you may discern the place. Where were you bred? How achieved you, etc. If I should tell my history, should seem like lies. Prithee speak, falseness cannot come from thee. And then he goes on and asks her over and over again, what were thy friends? What was that I perceived in thee? Did you really say you came from good parentage? He can't get rid of this question of your good parentage. Report your parentage, some such thing I said. Tell thy story. If thou considerest, prove the 1,000th part of my endurance. Thou art a man, and I have suffered like a girl. So again, we saw this language in Macbeth. We saw an anticipation of it in his being pregnant and so forth. Yet thou dost look like patience gazing on kings' graves and smiling extremity out of act. And for those of you who know Twelfth Night, this is the same image that we have of Viola describing herself as like patience, like on a monument smiling at grief. What were thy friends? How lost thou them? Thy name, my most kind virgin. And here we're looking for that recognition, that magic talisman, because we've had, so to speak, metaphor up to this point. Born here, parentage of a certain kind. Now we're going to get the thing itself. Recount, I do beseech you, come sit by me. My name is Marina. Oh, I am mocked, and thou by some insensate God sent hither to make the world to laugh at me. Patience, good sir. So here's that invocation to patience again. Or here, I'll cease. I'll stop talking. No, no. So again, he now wants her to keep talking. It is very much like the recognition scene between Lear and Cordelia after he awakens from death. Thou little knowest how thou dost startle me to call thyself Marina. Now, of course, she doesn't know the story of her name. The name was given me by one that had some power, my father and a king. How a king's daughter and called Marina. Are you flesh and blood? Have you a working pulse and are no fairy? Again and again, this play will want to underscore and re-emphasize the fact that this is not magic. This is the real deal. They are alive. They were never dead. Yeah.
Finding is a refinding, and this is the concretization of
Absolutely.
the refinding.
Absolutely. That's what I meant by the recognition again. Yes, exactly. This is the literalization, exactly, of that finding as refinding, that they meet for the first time the second time, and that he sees her through the half recognition of the wife, which if it's the same actor is even more uncanny. Called Marina, for I was born at sea. At sea, what mother? And so again, what I want here to underscore to you is how long this takes. How many little clues there. We get it already, right? They said it already. She said, I'm a king's daughter, I'm Marina. He lost a daughter, he's a king, etc. We could have closure to this recognition scene long before we have it, but it is immensely prolonged. It's like an aria. It goes on and on and on. And every moment of repetition brings him back closer to life. So it is a restorative for him. At sea, what mother? My mother was the daughter of a king who died the minute I was born. And she names the nurse, Lycorida, and so forth. How came you in these parts? Where were you bred? And now she begins to tell the story of the betrayal of Cleon and Dionysa, because, of course, as far as he knows, she's someplace else. She ought to be with Cleon and Dionysa. But the crew of pirates, I forgot to mention the pirates. The crew of pirates came and rescued me, brought me to Mytilene, and so forth. You think me an impostor? No, good faith, I am the daughter to King Pericles, if good King Pericles be, if he's alive. And now we have the recognition scene with give me a gash, bring me to present pain, pinch me, let me know that I'm alive, just as we saw with Lear again. And finally in this speech, O come hither, thou that begets him that did thee beget. So this, and again, I know I say this in my chapter because it struck me so powerfully, this is the redemption of the incest riddle. Thou that begets him that did thee beget. This is also an incest riddle. And it's been again, predicted by all these images of childbirth. But here it is redeemed of anything noxious or criminal or carnal, and it becomes instead a different kind of begetting. O come hither, thou that begets him that did thee beget. And the final talisman is going to be the mother's name. Is it no more to be your daughter than to say my mother's name was Thaisa? Thaisa was my mother, who did end the minute I began. And here I'm just going to hope they don't come barging in until we've been able to move just finally to the Thaisa daughter recognition scene in Act 5, Scene 3, where there are a couple of quick things I want to say. One is that in this play, the father-daughter recognition is foregrounded and the father-wife recognition is made subordinate or secondary. It is important, but it is not the center of the action. We'll have a different version of this when we come to look at The Winter's Tale. And secondly, and will probably have to be lastly because our time is coming up, we have both the repetition of the riddles and the questions. Did you not name a tempest, a birth, and death? She asks of the husband. Thaisa is recovered. O my lord, are you not Pericles? Like him you spake, like him you are. Did you not name a tempest, a birth, and death? The voice of dead Thaisa says, Pericles, and once again, you're going to be told, no. That Thaisa am I, supposed dead. This play is never going to say they really were dead. It's going to keep telling you they weren't, and drowned. Immortal Diane, so here's Diana again. And more tokens of recognition, the ring. And finally, Pericles, oh, come be buried a second time within these arms. So we have the recognition, the restoration, the resurrection, and the reburial as naturalization. Be buried a second time within these arms. So burial itself becomes metaphorical at the end of this play, where we had what seemed to be a literal burial in the sea that turned out not to be burying the dead. Here, come be buried a second time within these arms, where the act of burying is actually the act of unburying. This is a wonderful play. And this is a play that you can see why this wows audiences, because it shows you theater as magic. It shows you that what the play disavows, the performance performs. The play says this is not magic. The production gives the lie to that claim. I'll see you next week.